So, welcome all of you. Today we are at session 19 of the Gospel of Mark. Last time we had done something very pivotal, a very important session in the Gospel of Mark, which is considered to be a sort of a watershed or turning point in the lives of the disciples, especially where we find Peter making the confession. And we had gone deeply, not only in the Christology of the moment, but also the geography of the moment, because without knowing the geography and the backdrop of the place from where this beautiful confession on the part of Peter, who has been our representative, because when Peter confessed and made the proclamation of Jesus being the promised Messiah, we have to remember that this was done on behalf of all of us. So, regardless of the barriers of time and space, when Peter made that beautiful proclamation of Jesus being his own, it was on behalf of all of us. So, we had seen about the geography and the Christology, okay, which comes together, and we understand, okay, when Jesus is making the proclamation, okay, when he himself says that he tells Peter that you are going to be the rock on which I will build my church, and not even the gates of hell, gates of Hades will be able to prevail against you. And we remember how beautifully, we had shared that picture in the last session. At this particular place called Panias today, which in the past it used to be called Panias also, the same place called Caesarea Philippi, that was a place, okay, against the backdrop of this place which is supposed to be the gateway of hell. Jesus is making this beautiful proclamation, and he is strengthening Peter in his faith. He is, appointing Peter on behalf of the people of God to take his mission forward in this world. So we take off from that, and against this backdrop, we move along to the narrative of Mark. Today we take chapter 9, which is again another very pivotal moment in the Gospel of Mark. Today is entirely going to be the episode of the Transfiguration of our Lord. Session 19 in the Gospel of Mark, entirely we are going to do the episode of the Transfiguration. Sorry, is it lost? All right. Remember I told you last time when we were talking about this location from which Peter makes this beautiful proclamation of Jesus being the Messiah, that place which is today in Arabic called Banias, that point of time it was also called Caesarea, okay? Now this Caesarea Philippi, can you see the pointer here? This is the place where Peter, along with the disciples of Jesus and Jesus himself, they were spending time away from the city, because that was a time Jesus wanted to, train his disciples away from the crowds of Galilee. So this was a very scenic locale. It was a very scenic place, so which it was a place of lot of peace and quiet. I remember I also shared with you. This was a place which was a place where the pagans had a temple to the god Pan. So Pan, this god Pan, had this sanctuary, and so a lot of people used to come over there to worship, okay, the temple of god Pan. This was also the place where there was a temple that was erected to Caesar Augustus, which Herod had built. So this was quite a famous place, and this was a place that people were coming to. So this is the location, Caesarea Philippi. But there was another. I'm sharing this because you should not confuse with another place, Caesarea Maritima, which was another very famous coastal city that was built by Herod. And this was miles and miles away, and of course on the coast it was, okay. So this is the city where very extensive excavations are right now going on, because this is the place they say that Herod, whatever he might have been, okay, all the negativity that is associated with him, despite that, Herod is considered to be one of the greatest builders of antiquity. And so when he built this city along the coast, Caesarea, okay, he named it Caesarea Maritima. Maritima means it was a marine area. Caesar, in memory of Augustus, who was a very great friend, and that's how this coastal city. It was like a water hole of the rich people. So you can see this entire city is being excavated very extensively even now. This was the entire theater that he had built. There was a temple somewhere. This was the hippodrome, which was, the place. There used to be a lot of chariot racing and all. And this was a huge artificial port. It was not a natural harbor. And despite that, Herod was one man who always took up a challenge against nature to build up his beautiful projects. And so, he is greatly marveled at because of the harbor that he had built, though it was an artificial one, it was not a natural one. So I'm just sharing this before I go on to the key topic of today. You can read through this matter. These are the things that have been discovered there. I will not dwell more on this. This is a place called a Mithraeum. This used to be a shrine to the god Mithras, who was a Persian god, who was he was a huge hit with the Roman soldiers. For some reason, the Roman soldiers had a lot of devotion to this god Mithras, and they used to have their own secret cults where bulls used to be slaughtered and all. And it was called a sort of a mystery cult because only the members, could participate in all the rituals that were associated. People outside, without being a member, you could not have access to the cultic rituals that were held. So this is also one thing that has been dug out in the ongoing excavation. So Caesarea Maritima, and you have Banias, which is Caesarea Philippi. Now against that backdrop, when Peter has made that confession, 6 days after that, we have this event, a very pivotal one called the Transfiguration. When we look at the story of the Transfiguration, this is one story that figures in all the 3 synoptic accounts. Okay? It begins with chapter 9 here, and from here, and he said to them, truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God come back in power. And having said all these things, and against the backdrop of Peter's confession, then comes 6 days later the event of the Transfiguration. Let us read the account of Mark here. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. And then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice. This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him. And suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. I will not read the later part because we will be dwelling only on this event of the Transfiguration during this session. Let us break this down. If there is one text in the NT that must be seen through Hebrew eyes, when we say Hebrew eyes, we mean nothing more than through the eyes, through the lens of the Old Testament. It is this Transfiguration that deeply resonates with OT images and OT language. All throughout our lives, I'm sure all of us, including myself, we have read this account of the Transfiguration numerous times, countless number of times. Yet, if you don't look at this account through the eyes of the Old Testament, through the images, the language, the motives, and all that come across in this account, I'm sure the deep meaning behind this will be lost. And so that is the reason all three synoptics tell this story. That doesn't mean that John completely ignores it. John gives a totally different spin to it. I will explain that after a few slides. For the time being, we only focus on the three synoptics. Okay, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. All of them tell the story of the transfiguration. So the very fact that it is appearing in all the three gospels of all three evangelists, this must have been something very, very deep. It is flooded with OT images, not only images but language of the Old Testament. Themes also are from the Old Testament, and even the characters. The three main characters in the entire scene, of course, Jesus at the center, and talking to Elijah and Moses. It is sort of like, you can, in modern terminology, we can say it is hyperlinked, like when we make the presentation and we want to, go to back references. I want to, touch upon something from some other text. What do we normally do? We put in a hyperlink so that, the next slide that comes, it is that particular thing. So all this, interconnections, this networking, we normally use it. We call the term, we use the term hyperlink. So this episode is like, when you are actually reflecting and meditating upon the transfiguration of our Lord, it is something that you need to hyperlink with many of the compelling OT motives that are contained there. After Peter's confession of faith, proclaiming Jesus as the Messiah, and teachings on true discipleship, you remember, after Peter has made the proclamation, then afterwards, they want to, when Jesus says that the Messiah has to go to Jerusalem, he needs to suffer and die, that was something that was not palatable to Peter and to the other disciples as well. And that's how he, tries to, he rebukes Jesus. The word is used, rebukes Jesus, and tries to, sort of take him away from that idea. Why are you so obsessed with dying? And that, what response do we get from Jesus? Get away from me, Satan. Because Jesus knew the purpose and mission of his life. So going to Jerusalem was something that he was very resolute and set upon. So after Peter's confession of faith, proclaiming Jesus as the Messiah, and teaching on true discipleship, remember, there are a lot of, like, Jesus is constantly spending time, he's investing his time, he's investing his energy in order to form the disciples, because his time is, he knows very well his time on earth is drawing close, okay? He's coming closer to his end, and that's why he's preparing his, motley group of his disciples who are such weak people like us, and they are the ones who are going to take forward the mission of Jesus, and so he needs to teach them. And we are very much familiar of how many times he rebukes them. He's agonized by their lack of faith. They act so very dumb, like, things don't seem to register in their mind. So this is what has been going on. So against the backdrop of this, okay, on true discipleship, all these things have, we witnessed all this at Barnabas, Caesarea Philippi. The event of the transfiguration is reported in the synoptics. Why? Because the transfiguration story tells us that Jesus is the KOG incarnate. When I use this word KOG, it is a short form for Kingdom of God. Okay, so he is the one in whom the Kingdom of God is already manifest. It is seen in him. So these are the same. These are picked up from the Gospel of Luke, but more or less it is the same thing. So Peter makes the confession, then Jesus makes the first prediction of his death and rejection. Then he tells that if you are going to be my disciple, you need to take up your cross and follow me. There is no other way, okay, that you can truly be my disciple. So these are the sayings. And after the sayings, we have this event, okay, that after 6 days, Luke says 8 days. We will come to that. And this is the backdrop. So after the sayings, the evangelists tell us, okay, that the transfiguration occurred. Matthew reports that it took place after 6 days of the sayings. Mark tells us again it was after 6 days. Only Luke comes out with this, that it was after 8 days. Now let us see why. So more or less these are, with these minor distinctions, when we set them aside, basically the account is more or less the same. The characters that appear in the scene are the same. The significance is definitely the same. Let us break down, let us go forward. When we compare the synoptic accounts, we see that Mark and Matthew mention the event happening. They mention after 6 days, and as I pointed out, Luke says 8 days. Do you think there was some confusion among the evangelists? It is not so. There is a purpose behind it. Probably. There is a reason behind this, because each of the evangelists, don't forget, they have their own theological outlook when they are crafting their account of the gospel. So when Matthew is writing his gospel account, he definitely has a different theology at the back of the mind. He wants to portray Jesus as a new Moses. Remember that. Mark, we know, we are at it right now. For Mark, the central idea is Jesus is the crucified Messiah. He is a king, but his king, what kind of king? A crucified king who through his death and resurrection will emerge triumphant. So each of them are having their own theological purpose behind their gospel account. So here when Matthew and Mark, both of them report 6 days, it probably could be paralleling 6 days of Moses waiting prior to the revelation at Sinai. When you read the account, in the Exodus, we will see that when Moses, when he receives the first theophany, when God reveals himself, in the burning bush, he has already been on the mountain for 6 days. So that figure, the number 6, has a very deep significance probably for both Matthew and Mark. Similarly, while Luke, why does Luke say around 8 days? Probably he's drawing on the rich symbolism of the entire OT behind it. Now, what is the rich symbolism? Remember, in the scriptures, especially in the OT as well as in the NT in the New Testament as well, numbers have deep significance. Like the number 7 is, it speaks about wholeness, completeness. So every number has its own deep meaning and symbolism. So the number 8, probably when Luke is mentioning after 8 days, it probably could be, echoing the circumcision on the 8th day. Remember, in Jewish custom, the males, when they were born, on the 8th day, the child would be circumcised. Remember Jesus when he is taken to the temple to be circumcised on the 8th day. So similarly, circumcision on the 8th day after birth symbolized new creation. New life is born. And so, because the transfiguration is an event which is potent with, loaded with heavy meaning, it is something like, a new thing that is going to be born, where the eyes and hearts and minds of the apostles, will be opened up to the identity of Jesus, especially his divine identity. So it is sort of, something that echoes a new beginning, a new creation. 8 also probably refers to the number of humans on Noah's ark. When Noah went into the ark, there were altogether 8 of them. So that's how probably 8 days for Luke could bear this symbolism. So reflecting this rich symbolism, that is why from this was derived the idea in our early baptismal practices of the early church, especially, and later on also in medieval times and prior to that the Byzantine churches and all, you will find the baptismal fonts. I don't know if you have closely, observed the baptismal font of the church. It will be 8-sided, octagonal in shape. So 8, it reflects an idea. A new life is coming, is born, in God's family. So that is the significance of the number 8. So that probably could be the reason that Luke says that the incident occurred 8 days later. Now, why does Jesus take only 3 disciples? Why not more? Why only Peter, James and John? You can see there, they are sleeping there down. And Jesus on top of the mountain, is talking to Moses and Elijah. But why these 3 and why only these 3 disciples? Why not more? Why could he not take more? There is again symbolism here. In the Old Testament, testimony of one person would have no weight at all. If your testimony was to be accepted, it had to be borne witness to by at least 2 or 3 witnesses. So 2 or 3 witnesses should testify to whatever you say. So probably this is the reason, okay, on behalf of the New Testament, these 3 of them are taken. And when we see also Moses and Elijah, they are also over there, they are also testifying to Jesus, and that is the reason 2 characters from the Old Testament are bearing witness to Christ's humanity, just as 3 characters from the New Testament are bearing witness to Christ's divinity, which is unraveled before their eyes. So look at this. So Moses rose with his assistant Joshua. In the Old Testament, he was his right-hand man Joshua, and after Moses died, Joshua leads the people. So Moses rose with his assistant Joshua, and Moses went up into the mountain of God. This is what we see in Exodus. So when Moses was going up the mountain, Moses had several theophanies, meetings with God. So when he used to go, mostly he would take, on one occasion he had taken only Joshua. Another occasion, he had taken 70 people who represented the elders. But there also, as he went up and up the mountain, there were degrees, of holiness on the mountain. So as he went up, he finally would be alone. So here the empty Joshua, it is very striking to think that when Moses took Joshua along with him, Jesus' name also in Hebrew is Yeshua. And Joshua is nothing but Joshua. So the actual meaning of Jesus, we say Jesus, Jesus, that is an anglicized version of the name of the Lord. But his actual name, in Hebrew context his name was Yeshua, and Yeshua was also Joshua. So necessity of having 2 or 3 witnesses also laid down in the book of Deuteronomy. If you go to chapter 17, and since I have not put out all the things because the slides will become too many. Similarly, you have that mentioned also in Matthew and 2 Corinthians and 1 Timothy. So this is the reason probably Jesus takes 3 disciples so that what was going to occur, they would bear testimony to it. Let's go to the next. Now going to the mountain of the transfiguration. Which is the mountain of the transfiguration? There are 2 contenders for the site. One is Mount Hermon in the Golan Heights, where Banias is, the site of Peter's confession of Jesus as Messiah, which is most plausible. If you ask me what would I believe, I would be more inclined to believe that it was this place, near Mount Hermon, in the Golan Heights, because just prior to that, remember, Peter's confession is coming here at Caesarea Philippi, and this is the place there near Mount Hermon. Second contender for the site, which is very commonly today in Christian tradition and all, you must have heard a lot about this Tabor ministries and all. So Mount Tabor is normally considered to be the mountain of the transfiguration. So second is Mount Tabor, which is in the Jezreel Valley, very close to Nazareth. So when you stand near Nazareth, across you will be able to see the Mount of the Transfiguration, Mount Tabor. I have a slide, the next one. So regardless of which mountain it is, what's most important and significant is the fact that it occurred on a mountain. We may not really know which is the mountain, but the fact that it occurred on a mountain bears very deep significance. And not that it happened maybe in the Jordan Valley, nor not in the wilderness or a town or a city. So why mountains specifically? Why not any other place? Why did this incident not take place soon after there only, where Peter's confession took place? Why he had to go up a high mountain? We know it was a high mountain. Why mountain? Because mountains are places of divine epiphany. What is the meaning of epiphany? God visiting his people. Whenever kings would, go and visit his subject, he would send out a big edict or a proclamation saying that, on such and such date and such time, the king will be coming to visit this particular place. So that was called an epiphany. That is why Christmas is considered to be an Epiphany, because God becomes incarnate, He comes to visit His people. So mountains, okay, in the Old Testament were considered to be places of divine epiphany, divine revelation, places of theophany. What is a theophany? Theo means God. So theophany is God revealing Himself. Like in the Gospel of Mark, we have seen, okay, many theophanies, when Jesus comes walking in the water, when He stills the storm. So those are also moments of theophany wherein like God reveals Himself in the person of Jesus. So God likes to manifest Himself on mountains. So mountains are places where God likes to play big. This is the real picture. So which mountain we don't know. Possibly Hermon. Hermon, this is the Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon is it is in today's Lebanon, and often it is snow-clad. There is a lot of snow that comes on this mountain. This is Mount Tabor. Okay, this Tabor is the one that common belief. People say that it is Mount Tabor where the transfiguration took place. Now, mountains in salvation history, what is the significance? Why? I will take you back now a little bit, because I remember I told you, without you hyperlinking to all the OT images, you will not be able to draw the peel off the layers in order to arrive at a deep meaning of the transfiguration of our Lord. First, we have this example of Mount Moriah, where sacrifice of Isaac. Okay, you remember Isaac was supposed to be sacrificed by Abraham. He takes him, makes him carry the wood. It is on Mount Moriah. David builds an altar there at Moriah. He buys, a plot of land over there from that Araunah. Mount Moriah is actually also Mount Zion, more or less today, okay, where the Temple of Jerusalem finally stood. Solomon builds his temple on Mount Moriah. So this is all told to us in Genesis and Chronicles. Similarly, Horeb, which is a very great mountain. Sinai and Horeb were considered to be one and the same mountain. This is the mountain where God revealed Himself to Moses in the burning bush. This is the place, this is a very holy mountain because the covenant was basically given by God over here. And Moses experienced lots of theophanies over here. Similarly, this was also the place where Elijah also, when he was running away, when he was fleeing from the murderous Queen Jezebel, when he slew all the prophets at Mount Carmel, the prophets of Baal. He was running away because he was being pursued by the queen. And where did he run to? He comes to the mountain Horeb, the same place where Moses also experienced his theophany. So they were patterned after temple with 3 courts. This I told you, like how when Abraham had to go up the high mountain, there were certain places only up till where the 70 could accompany him. Then further on, his close companion like Joshua could accompany, and right on top it had to be Moses alone. Similarly, we have Mount Hor. This is the place where Aaron dies, the brother of Moses, and his son Phinehas is vested as high priest. We find this account in Numbers chapter 20. Then another famous mountain, Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. This was the bone of contention between the Samaritans and the Jews. They considered Gerizim to be the holy mountain, whereas the Jewish people, for them, Jerusalem was the mountain that God had put His name. Okay, so this was considered to be the mountain of blessings and curses. And this was also the place when Joshua, he finally brought the tribes into the promised land. They drew a covenant again over here at Shechem, which is at the foothills of Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. Then we have this Mount Nebo. Of course, this is another famous mountain where Moses sees the promised land and there he's supposed to have died. Nobody knows where, okay? But from here, God gives him the sight of the promised land, and He tells him that this would be the land he would never set his foot upon. And finally, we have Mount Zion, Jerusalem, the chosen city of God, and foreshadowing of the church. So this is the significance of mountains in salvation history and also now in Christology, and that is the reason Jesus chose to reveal Himself specifically on a high mountain. I don't know if you ever heard about Eden, the Mount Eden. I'm sure all of you might be a little confused because you must be wondering, what am I putting on Mount Eden? It is Garden of Eden. It is, you're right, it is the Garden of Eden. But I don't know if any of you, it ever occurred to you that probably the Garden of Eden was also on a mountain. Because we know from this line in Genesis that from Eden flows a river, so it was going downhill, which splits into 4 rivers to water the whole world. So you see, definitely the Garden of Eden was again on a high mountain. So it would not be wrong to say the Garden of Eden on Mount Eden. Okay? So Eden, the Garden of God, in parallel with the holy mountain of God. Also, this parallel is drawn in the book of Ezekiel. Similarly, Isaiah also draws the connection. He describes Zion, okay, temple in Eden-like terms. Like this is the place where God will speak tenderly to his people. The prophet Joel also describes the land around Zion as like the Garden of Eden. So Eden had deep symbolism in the OT. The end time temple with its Eden-like river is on a very high mountain. Okay, so this we find in the book of Revelation in the New Testament, and in the OT it is the prophet Ezekiel. So Eden also had a huge significance, and here we are going to see what connections we can draw here. Mount Eden, the mountain of the Garden of Eden. All this text which I cited in the previous slide, one way or another, describe the paradise of God on a mountain. Hence, we call it Garden of Eden, but we can also call it the mountain of the Garden of Eden. It signifies, this is very important, it signifies that humanity, when God created us humans, humanity began on a mountain where God dwelt and walked amongst his people. So this is the deep meaning and significance behind the mountain of the Garden of Eden. This is where God brought us into this world. Humanity was born on this mountain where God dwelt amongst his people. He walked amongst us. All mountains in scripture are thus patterned on what happened on the mountain of the Garden of Eden. Thus, mountain is a place of theophany. This is a place where God chooses to reveal himself. White clothes, Old Testament prophets, and Christ Exodus. I want you to focus here. This is Mark's account. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. Okay? Let us see what was the significance of this raiment, this dazzling white clothes, that we see about, of Jesus, such as no one on earth could bleach them. This is an account from Luke. Luke also mentions the same thing. And as he was praying, the appearance of his face was altered, and his clothing became dazzling white, or bright as a flash of lightning. And behold, 2 men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his departure. In the bracket in Greek, it is called Exodus, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now, when we compare these 3 accounts about, how Jesus is described, how his clothes appear to be dazzling white, look at the text, the comparison between all the 3. Matthew says, and he was transfigured. Mark also says, and he was transfigured. In Greek, that word is put over there, metamorpho. Okay, both of them are using this word metamorpho. This is the word from which we get our word metamorphosis. Luke, when you look at Luke over here, Luke does not use that word transfigured. He straightaway says, and as he was praying, the appearance of his face was altered, and his clothing became dazzling white. And Luke is only one who also mentions to us that Jesus was in prayer when this happened. Okay, so here we see transfigured means he was changed, his entire being was transformed. He looked to be, a very dazzling white figure, completely transformed. Okay, this is how each of them report. Now, why would Jesus look this way? suddenly why there is such a, very surreal transformation in how he appears. We need to go to the OT. The shining face is a manifestation of a heavenly reality. Luke uses the word dazzling, ex extracto, for his clothing, that is a Greek word for his clothing, an indication that he is a heavenly being. Now, going back to the Old Testament, okay, in the Old Testament, remember when Moses came down the mountain, nobody could look at his face because his face was radiant and shining. Like, they had to, literally hold their hands over their eyes and they would not be able to see. Why? Because Moses reflected God's glory, whom he had seen face to face. Because the Jewish belief, and always it was, that when you see the face of God, no mortal can see the face of God and yet live. Moses was the only one. But the shining face of Moses reflected God's glory which visited him. Hence, his radiance was from an external source. No doubt Moses' face was very radiant and nobody could look up to his countenance. But that glory which reflected on his face, it came from God. So the external source was God with whom he had built up his intimacy. But what about Jesus here on the Mount of Transfiguration? The glory of Jesus is from within him. The radiance is from his own Godhead, he being Yahweh himself. Hence, his humanity too is divine. So thus in effect, what we can say is, the transfiguration of Jesus is a lifting of the veil of Jesus' humanity to reveal his divine identity. This summarizes very beautifully, because that moment when the three of them were witnessing what was happening there on this Mount Hermon or Mount Tabor, whatever that mountain of the Transfiguration, it was actually a veil being lifted up from over the humanity of Jesus, wherein these three of them could peep into his divinity. The shining face and glowing body, again taking you back to the OT this. The face of Moses, as I told you, shown as a result of speaking with God in the mountain. Exodus, the book of Exodus tells us this. Similarly, not only Moses, the man on the throne in Ezekiel's vision, you remember? The prophet Ezekiel is famous for all his visions, very frightening visions in many of the cases. And one most enduring vision was the vision of the Merkabah. What was the Merkabah? Merkabah was the flashing, chariot throne of God. Remember, even in the book of Daniel, when we had done this, reference to the book of Daniel, to Jesus' messiahship, we had come across this. So in Ezekiel's vision, the man on the throne in Ezekiel's vision was like glowing metal and fire. I will put out that picture here for you, and more on that, we will be doing on the next slide. Similarly, in the book of Daniel, Ancient of Days, you remember this phrase we have come across? The Ancient of Days is being referred to. Who is being referred to here? God himself. In Daniel, has clothing as white as snow, and his hair is like pure wool. Similarly, in Psalm 104, we again come across that expression, God covers himself with light as with a garment. So shining face and glowing body is symptomatic of the presence of the divine. Clothing bright as a flash of lightning. Ex extracto, that is the Greek for, gleam like lightning. It was so white and so gleaming that it was very difficult to look at it. His clothes became dazzling white. At the ascension, similarly, something like this we also see in the book of Acts. At the ascension, two men stood by the disciples in white robes. Remember in Acts chapter 1 in 10, when Jesus is being taken up and the apostles are all looking up. These two men, they come and they ask him, what are you looking at? Jesus has ascended into heaven. So that is what is being referred to. And these two men stood by the disciples in white robes. In the empty tomb, similarly in the Gospel of Mark, towards the end, we see this, a young man sitting on the right side dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. And the armies of heaven, again in the book of Revelation, arrayed in fine linen, white and pure, were following him on white horses. So this is the rich symbolism of something, extremely bright like lightning, a flash of lightning, ex extractor, what is called in Greek. Now going back to Ezekiel's vision, remember this was it. And above the expanse over their heads, there was a likeness of a throne in appearance like sapphire. This is something similar we also find in the book of Exodus. And seated above the likeness of a throne was a likeness with a human appearance. And upward from what had the appearance of his waist, I saw as it were gleaming metal. Remember that person who is there in the middle on that flaming chariot, the Merkaba? It appeared like a gleaming metal, like the appearance of fire enclosed all around. And downward from what had the appearance of his waist, I saw as it were the appearance of fire, and there was brightness around him, like the appearance of the bow, that is a rainbow, also referred to in the book of Revelation, that is in the cloud on the day of rain. So was the appearance of the brightness all around. Such was the appearance, the likeness of the glory of the Lord. What is most important is this phrase, the glory of the Lord. What is being reflected there in that vision that Ezekiel witnesses, that of the flaming chariot, the chariot throne of God? It is the manifestation of the glory of the Lord, Yahweh. Okay, which in Hebrew is called the Kabod Yahweh. Kabod is the glory of God. And when I saw it, I fell on my face, Ezekiel testifies, and I heard the voice of one speaking. Let us go back. So what is it? This is the picture of Ezekiel's vision. Can you see somebody here, like the Son of Man in Daniel also is referred to? The manifestation of the man-like glory of the Lord. This is the glory of the Lord, the Merkaba. This is the entire Merkaba. Okay, is the fact the Son of God, Son of Man. And now on the Mount of Transfiguration, he once more appears as the dazzling, radiant figure. So when we try to draw the connection between Ezekiel's vision, why this resplendent light is emanating from the figure of Jesus on the mountain of the Transfiguration, it is because he is the manifestation of God's glory, the Kabod Yahweh. Okay, so Transfiguration once more appears as a dazzling, radiant figure. The term Merkaba or Merkaba also it is called, Hebrew for chariot, is the throne or chariot of God. The origin of Merkaba is attributed to the Old Testament prophet Ezekiel, who described his vision of the throne of God of Merkaba. This is another picture. Okay, he sees as the chariot is moving, all the wheels of the chariot are churning and turning. Now, when coming back to the episode of the Transfiguration, that entire scene that is unraveling, unfolding on the mountain, why do we see Moses and Elijah and why not anybody else talking to Jesus? When these three of them, they woke up from their slumber, they were obviously sleeping, probably it was night, as how Luke reports us, it looks like it was in the night, or maybe early hours of the morning before dawn, we do not really know, whatever it was. But what they saw was, they could identify, it is surprising that they could identify that one was Moses and the other was Elijah. And they are talking, they are in deep conversation with whom? With Jesus at the center. So why Moses and Elijah? There's a reason behind that probably. Both have close ties with the theophany at Mount Sinai. Remember Moses also? Okay, all the theophanies took place on Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb, whatever it is called. Horeb means the mountain of God. Elijah also had a similar theophany. He experienced the gentle presence of God at Mount Horeb. So both of them had ties to the sacred mountain and speech from God. Not only did they, experience the presence of God, they also heard the voice of God. That's very important. They saw and they heard him. Both have unusual departures from this world. Elijah in a chariot of fire. Okay? In the book of Kings, we come across this, how Elijah was taken in a chariot of fire, and that was why the belief was very strong among the Jews that before the Messiah could come, Elijah must return. And in this account also, later on after the transfiguration, they will be dealing with it. So this Elijah in a chariot of fire is taken up by God, and Moses with God secretly bearing his body. Remember I told you at Mount Nebo, after he was shown the promised land, he passed away. So nobody knows how Moses died and how his body was secretly buried. So these were two, very powerful beliefs among the Jews at the time of Jesus and prior to that a prophet like Moses, as was promised by God, would definitely come. Okay, a prophet like Moses, and prior to the Messiah coming, Elijah would definitely return. So Elijah formed part of the end time expectation of first century Jews based on the prophecy of Malachi. Remember where at the opening of Mark's gospel, how he, brings about this, he mentions when he's talking about John the Baptist, he is hinting that John the Baptist is actually Elijah version 2, return to prepare the way of the Lord. So Moses embodied the Torah and Elijah the prophet. So summing up all these three together, we come to this. So Moses was an embodiment of the Torah which are the 5 books of Moses. That is a gift that was given to the Jewish people, the law, the Torah. And Elijah represented the prophets. So when they talk about the Old Testament, okay, the Hebrew Bible is nothing but the law, the prophets and the writings which were added on later on. But during Jesus' time, it was the law and the prophets that made up the word of God for them. So Moses embodied the Torah, Elijah the prophets. Thus the entire Old Testament bore witness of Jesus as the Messiah. So in one frame, with the 3 heavenly beings in deep conversation on the mountain of transfiguration, we see the Old Testament, okay, bearing witness to the coming, to the fulfillment of the prophecies that were made there and how they would be fulfilled in Jesus. Why are Moses and Elijah there? Further explanation. Mount Sinai is a place of revelation for Moses, the same mountain on which God later makes his covenant with his people. The same mountain is also called Mount Horeb, the place Prophet Elijah flees to when he is pursued by the murderous queen Jezebel for having slain her prophets of Baal at Mount Carmel. So hence in these 2 OT figures, the entire OT, the Old Testament, is represented as witnesses to the humanity and divinity of Jesus, the incarnate Son of God. And this is very beautifully summarized by Saint Ephraim of Syria. Okay, he was a very famous lay teacher. He was not a priest or anything, but there are volumes and volumes of poems and writings of this man, okay, who was a key figure in the Syrian church in early Christianity. So Saint Ephraim of Syria, the famous teacher and hymn writer of the early church, he says this. I will put out the next frame using exactly his words. The OT prophets, represented by Moses and Elijah, are witnessing, what are they witnessing? The humanity of Jesus. They had not seen Jesus, okay, because in their time, Jesus was yet to be born, the fulfillment of God's promises. So now they are here, in this time of Jesus, they are witnessing to the full humanity of Jesus. Just as the anti-disciples, Peter, James and John, are witnessing, on the other hand, what are they witnessing? They have seen the human Jesus, but now they can peep into the window of his divinity. They are witnessing the divinity of Jesus. So Ephraim puts it very beautifully here. Apostles and prophets together in one frame. At the transfiguration, the prophets rejoiced because they had seen Christ's humanity, which they had not known. And the apostles rejoiced because they had seen the glory of his divinity, which they had not known. So this is Saint Ephraim the Syrian. Now this is like we have seen the other day. They were in deep conversation, and this is something only Luke tells us. Mark and Matthew does not report. They only tell us that, this is what they saw, Peter, James and John. But Luke takes us, okay, into something very deeper. That is why Luke's account of the transfiguration is very beautiful and deep. What the were Jesus, Moses, and Elijah talking about? They were definitely talking about something. They were talking about, they were talking about an exodus. That previous slide of his, I just read out some time ago. You can go back to it and they will see. So they were talking about the exodus. Now, what was this exodus that they were referring to? Exodus means departure, means you're going away. It could mean death. Okay? When Peter writes in his letter to Peter, chapter 1, verse 15, when he's talking about his own death, he refers to it as exodus, that is departure from this life. But there's a deeper meaning in the Old Testament. Commonly, we all know the story of the Exodus from Egypt. So when we talk about the Exodus, we are specifically talking about the salvation history that unfolded when God intervened in the lives of the people when they were in Egypt, when they were suffering, with his mighty hand, how he delivered them. So the Exodus from Egypt. So what were Jesus, Moses, and Elijah talking about? Luke tells us over here, and I put out all the three things over here. And behold, two men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. So this is what Luke tells us. They were speaking about his departure. Whose departure? Jesus' departure, which he was about to undertake and accomplish at Jerusalem. When we talk about Exodus, when we go to the book of Exodus, Exodus talks also about the departure of the slaves from Egypt going towards the promised land. And in the third month of the departure, again Exodus, of the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt, on the same day, they came into the wilderness of Sinai. This is what Exodus, the book of Exodus tells us. The departure, that is the Exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. And in the book of Kings here, and it came to pass in the 440th year after the departure of the children of Israel, again what is being referred to as the Exodus event, where the Israelites went as slaves, they went out from Egypt, saved by Moses and with the intervention of the mighty hand of God. So when they are talking, only Luke tells us, as I told you about this, Exodus generally would mean departure, but in the context of the Old Testament, it refers to the Exodus from Egypt. And what is this Exodus from Egypt is one defining event, that defines a Jew, because that is that single most event which gave birth to Israel as a nation. It was one defining event that gave birth to the nation of Israel. The event that brought liberation from slavery with the intervention of the mighty hand of God. Remember, the book of Exodus begins with God heard the cry of the people. They cried out to God and God heard their cry. And God heeded their cry, and that's how then we see all those events of the Exodus. So Exodus was something that was, a very defining event for any Israelite. That defined them. That was their identity. They were born as a people of God on the day when God intervened in their life and brought about liberation and took them towards the promised land. So when the three heavenly beings are talking about the Exodus, it could only mean one thing. And what could that Exodus mean? As Luke points out, is Exodus of what he needs to accomplish in Jerusalem. So what are they talking about? The crucifixion of Jesus at Jerusalem that would trigger the new Exodus that would bring about liberation of the whole of humanity through the triumphant resurrection that would follow. That is the departure that was imminent, the departure to Jerusalem, the place of his suffering, death and resurrection. So do you see, we sometimes when we read the account of the transfiguration, if we don't connect with the OT motives, we will be losing out on the true meaning of what really transpired on the Mount of Transfiguration. This is a continuation slide of the explanation. Jesus fulfills the hopes of Israel through the exodus of his crucifixion. So do you see the connection? His impending death through crucifixion is actually going to be the exodus through which he finally will bring glory to all of us. So the exodus of his crucifixion is what is being referred to. So Jesus fulfills the hopes of Israel through the exodus of his crucifixion. When his body is placed in the tomb, Jesus goes into exile, into darkness and death. And 3 days later, when he emerges from his grave, he bears all humanity on his shoulders. What one man, Jesus, does, he does for all humanity. When he dies, we die. When he is buried, we are buried. And when he rises, we are raised. That's the exodus that Jesus brings to pass for us and for all humanity by resolutely going to Jerusalem. If he had to turn away his face from Jerusalem, would this come to pass? It's good for us to think. Now going further into that, now after this, now Peter and those who were with him were heavy with sleep because it was night. But when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. And as the men were parting from him, they are seeing now this vision, okay, is slowly fading. Peter said to Jesus, Master, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah. And Luke adds this line, not knowing what he said. Now when he talks about these tabernacles, Peter is all very nervous. This is definitely a very nervous response of his. But whatever is this, okay, his nervous response or whatever, there was symbolism in what he says. The word tent that Peter talks about, setting up for the 3 heavenly figures, has a deeper meaning drawing from OT symbolism. The Greek word skene actually refers to the word tabernacle, referring to the tabernacle in the desert when God dwelt amongst or tabernacled amongst his people during the wilderness wanderings. Remember, after the Exodus comes the book of Numbers. And what do we see in the book of Numbers? Numbers tells us all their experiences, their journey towards the promised land. So they are caught up in the wilderness. It takes them 40 years finally to come to the promised land. So in this wilderness wandering, God gives them directions of how, he tells Moses how, the tent of meeting, it was called the tent of meeting, which is called the tabernacle. That was a place, how it was to be, built up. There are extensive directions that God gives. And that was God wanted to be close to his people. That is, God dwelt amongst his people. So when they say dwelt among, the word over there in Greek is skene, tabernacle, amongst his people during the wilderness wandering. Now there's also a Jewish harvest festival called the Feast of Tabernacles, which is the 3rd annual pilgrimage festival, which was a commemoration of God's providential care of the people of Israel during their wilderness wanderings in the desert. Now during the time of Jesus, it was common practice to journey to Jerusalem to celebrate this festival, during which people would live in leafy shelters, like they would make small huts, like all covered with leaves. They would go to Jerusalem because it was a pilgrimage center, pilgrimage festival. It was a feast considered to be the feast of great assembly. So they had to know all the means. So when they went over there, they would live, in small tents which would be covered with leaves and all, as symbolic of what? Okay, commemorating their life in the desert when they were wandering as a people towards the promised land. So these leafy huts were called sukkah. Till today, even the Jews, they celebrate this festival. It is celebrated in the fall, not in the spring. In the spring, we have Passover, that is followed by Pentecost. So this is the 3rd great festival which comes during, prior to the winter, in the fall. And so these leafy huts used to be called sukkah. So this was also sort of a tent, and the festival accordingly got its name Sukkot, okay, Feast of Tabernacle. So when Peter is saying that let us build these 3 structures, he is probably all nervous and he is referring to it. But the symbolism cannot be lost. By tent, what is Peter alluding to? Despite it being a nervous response, we know he is very real. We know what Peter is, the beautiful character. He is a very simple, childlike character Okay, so he simply is probably muttering something because he doesn't know what to say because he's so electrified by what is happening. So, despite it being a nervous response to an electrifying moment, a surreal experience, Peter is picking up the tabernacle or tent language from the Old Testament. There's something deep going on here. The three heavenly beings don't need a tent or a tabernacle because we have one, a new tabernacle, the flesh and blood man Jesus, where the glory of God, the Kabod Yahweh, dwells. He is now the living tabernacle, tabernacled amongst us, so God in the midst of all of us. And the Gospel of John, as I told you, does not tell us about the transfiguration, but the entire Gospel speaks about, the very opening of the Gospel. God came to dwell, the Word became flesh and lived amongst us. So Jesus came to dwell or tabernacle among us. John repeatedly appeals to tabernacles imagery throughout his gospel to show us that Jesus came to dwell with us and provide for us. So when Peter is saying, come, I will let us build together, he is actually, pointing out to a deeper meaning that this tense which he is saying that he will build, maybe with the help of his other companions. This is not required because the tabernacle is already there. The flesh and blood, humanity of Jesus is the real tabernacle in which God's glory is residing, manifested, and seen by us. This is, skene, this is the word in Greek which refers to tent or tabernacle. This is a picture in the Old Testament. This was the way the tabernacle used to be built. And wherever the Israelites followed, they would carry this along with them. So they deeply believed that God was, residing with them, dwelling with them. So that was the significance of the tabernacle, in which finally was also the Ark of the Covenant. I've put out these pictures, how Sukkah is, Sukkot is even today celebrated. Today, of course, how the modern Jews and all, they will, build up some, sort of, like you'll remember, for this Ganesh festival among the Hindus, that Matodi, you remember this Matodi, they do, sort of, a small little shamiana, and which they will tie all the fruits and all, signifying that these are the first fruits that they are offering God. So here this is a painting which shows how this shelter, this sukkah used to be built by the modern Jews. And these fruits, the etrog, especially the citron, the big one, this is used in the rituals of the festival. Now coming to the cloud and the voice, we have done with the appearance. Now there was also a cloud when they were seen. As he was saying these things, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. And a voice came out of the cloud saying, "This is my son, my chosen one, to him listen." And when the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent and told no one in those days anything of what they had seen. This is a similar account of Mark. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice, "This is my beloved son, the beloved, this is my son, the beloved, listen to him." And suddenly when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. Now that word, when you say this overshadowed, in Greek, that is the word for it is episkiazo. That is what, when I share with you the next slide, you will understand. When we talk about, the cloud coming and covering, overshadowing means like, somebody puts a huge mantle over something and, covers you with shade. And so Moses was not able, this is a account in Exodus, when the cloud of God, when the tabernacle was filled with the glory of God, there would be a huge cloud that would be hanging over the tabernacle. And so Moses was not able to enter into the tabernacle of testimony. It was also called a tent of testimony, tent of meeting, because the cloud was overshadowing. That cloud used to be called the Shekinah in Hebrew. and the tabernacle was filled with the glory of God, so Moses could not enter because God's glory overshadowed the entire tabernacle. That is called, that word overshadowment, episkiasu, the cloud and the voice. What is the meaning of it? The glory cloud is enveloping, is covering the tabernacle in the desert in the Exodus account which we just saw. The glory cloud referred to as Shekinah in Hebrew. Okay, in the Transfiguration story, the presence of Jesus is the cloud. Jesus is like the Shekinah. Okay, his presence is the Shekinah glory. His body is a tabernacle in which the Kabod Yahweh, the glory of Yahweh, is manifested and is residing. Now, why clouds? Now, clouds also find a very deep meaning in the Old Testament. I put on also in the New Testament, okay, but more in the Old Testament. God led Israel by a cloud, a pillar cloud. Remember, as they were going, they would be, in the night they would see a pillar of fire, and the daytime a cloud would be leading them. So, what way they had to go? The glory of Yahweh appeared in a cloud. God descended on Mount Sinai in a cloud. So you see, this cloud imagery is very, very strong. When Moses went up on Mount Sinai, a cloud covered the mountain, so people knew, okay, down at the base of the mountain, that God was talking to Moses. So the glory cloud covered the tabernacle. Isaiah also predicts when a cloud and fire will cover Zion. Ezekiel similarly opens with a vision of a great cloud. So everywhere, cloud, okay, is a symbol of God's divine presence. In fact, it is like a cloak that God uses to hide himself, because no mortal can see him and live. And that is the reason God cloaks himself, okay, cloaks his divine presence with a cloud. So cloud becomes an icon or symbol of God's presence. When a cloud shows up in a theophany, that cloud is God's clothing, so that he cannot be seen. The cloud in such instances is an icon of his presence. It is a powerful indicator that God has shown up. That you come to know that something has happened, but God has, his footsteps you have heard silently. That God has visited his people. And not only has he shown up, but here he has spoken to, just as he spoke to Moses and Elijah. So in the episode of the Transfiguration, not only is this whole spectacle unraveling before the eyes of these three disciples, apostles of Jesus, but they also hear a voice. This is the last slide, second last slide. Manifold metalepsis in God's speech. Now, what is the meaning of metalepsis? Metalepsis is, when one text, it is more or less like that image of the hyperlink that I shared with you. So, manifold metalepsis in God's speech is when God is speaking, okay, now in the cloud which we'll be taking, there are cross references to many of the things that have happened in the Old Testament. Like for example, in Psalm 2, verse 7, okay, God says to the psalmist, he said to me, thou art my son, you are my son, okay, you are my son, oh you smos, that is how it is pronounced in Greek. So similarly, okay, God calls his servant, the chosen one, recalls the servant of Isaiah. In the suffering servant, songs of Isaiah, he often refers to his suffering servant as a chosen one. Behold my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen one, in whom my soul delights. Okay, so God is here referring to his chosen servant, okay, as the chosen one. You are my son, he said first, then he says you are the chosen one, O eklestos. That is the meaning in Greek. And similarly, finally, a direct command, okay, to him listen, is a direct quote from Deuteronomy. Only with the tense of the verb changed to future tense, you shall listen to him. Here, of course, the Moses typology is blatant. God promises to raise up a prophet like Moses, him you shall listen to. So it is a sort of a foreshadowing, okay, the fulfillment of God's promise that prior to the coming of the Messiah, he would definitely send a prophet like Moses. A prophecy that is fulfilled in Jesus. So that is called metalepsis. One text, okay, speaking to another text in order to highlight each other and draw out deeper meaning. And this is exactly God says it towards the end when he tells, okay, when the vision is fading, they hear the voice of God. They hear the voice of God, and God tells them, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." So God directly acknowledges here. This voice is heard for the first time in the Gospel of Mark at the time of Jesus' baptism. But Mark doesn't tell us that anybody else heard this voice, but Jesus heard it. So God was affirming him in his mission. Here, God is testifying that he is his beloved Son, and to whom is he revealing this? Before his very poor apostles. That is my beloved Son. Listen to him, the command. To him listen. Now the implications for us, transfiguration, and what are the implications for us? When the clouds disappeared, we come to the final end. When the clouds disappeared, what happens? They look around and there is no one except Jesus. All that radiance, okay, that electrifying light, that radiance has all gone. It is like as if they were, they must have felt like, was this real? Was this really happening? Or were they dreaming? So when the clouds disappeared, okay, the radiance is gone, there is no one except Jesus. He is the reason Moses and Elijah were there. When we look at the transfiguration and we want to draw rich lessons from it, these are the things that we need to ponder and dwell upon. Okay? Then finally, when the whole thing disappears, at the center of the entire vision, who remains? It's only Jesus. He is the reason Moses and Elijah were there in the first place. He is the reason also Peter, James, and John were there. He is the reason, in fact, even the mountain was there, the cloud was there. If it was not him, all these elements would not be there in the narrative at all. Everything that happened here in this episode of the Transfiguration of the Lord was a finger pointing to Christ, the promised one, the chosen one, the beloved Son, the one that all history was preparing for, is now shown up. So here God is like, pointing out, this is one the world was waiting for. And this is whom, okay, I reveal to you, the veil is lifted. He is my divine, my beloved Son. Jesus and only Jesus is the one in whom all our hopes and God's promises are fulfilled. Furthermore, we have a new tabernacle, the flesh and blood man Jesus, where the glory of God dwells, the Kabod Yahweh dwells. He is now the living tabernacle, the living temple, tabernacled amongst us. And if at the birth of Jesus we learn that God has become man, then at the transfiguration of Jesus we learn that this man is also God, has been God, and will always be God. And this is what the Greek fathers, the early church fathers would call, okay, they call Theoanthropos, the God-man. That is divinity and humanity in one person, fully God and fully man. And he is the one in whom all our hopes and desires in this world and the next stand fulfilled. So this is the end of the session. Before that, I would request you, imagine yourself if you were one of the fourth one, okay, witnessing this spectacle. How would this impact you? How would your life be changed? Now, when we cross over to the remaining episodes, okay, of chapter 9, we will see that despite these three of them, they have had such a close encounter of the divine. Yet, the impact on the three of them, we will be assessing in the next session. But before that, you ask yourself, had I been a witness to the transfiguration? Imagine yourself being on that mountain of transfiguration. You are seeing this happening before you. How much your life would have changed? Would you be any different from the disciples? Would we? This is something that we all need to ponder. So thank you for attending this session. This is the end of it.